When I was a kid, I was very curious. So a kid, just imagine shorter Griff, still got the beard. But it was really difficult to punish somebody like me because for a whole lot of different reasons, I lived in my head. Then if you combine just a general lack of respect for punishment with that type of curiosity, it's not always a good thing. And I stayed on my grandma's farm when I was younger. And one day I remember my uncle, he comes up on the driveway on a motorcycle and parks, gets off, points at the muffler and says, "Don't touch that." And then he walked away. So I'll segue there to tell you, uh, we knew not to disobey the uncles. And if you did, sometimes you went into the basement with Huey. And Huey was a Halloween mask. That Halloween mask and coveralls and gloves stuffed with stuffing or straw, I think, and sat in a chair. And most of the time it was just a threat, but sometimes somebody would get locked down there for misbehaving, and you just hear the terror. And it happened to me a few times. You go down and you see Huey, and then you're up by the door, and it was bad. So that's the threat. We knew that was there. So it's a good time to say that I'd never really been that worried about the physical danger of things. So these type of situations, like I'm afraid just like everybody else. That sometimes I just do it anyway. Like I got to get that experience. So I wrapped my hand around that muffler all at once, and I I I can remember the sensation, but you can't feel it. But I remember also going over to the well pump and running water over my hand, and then I don't really remember anything about the recovery or anything. Just the lead up and then that experience. And that could cause you to think enough childhood trauma would deter somebody. But you also might have heard the term curiosity killed the cat. And so in an apartment building, like I knew this was going to be bad. I knew it. Um, Everybody they kind of explained it to me already, but I still went out in the hallway. I snuck out, and I pulled the fire alarm. They showed me where it was and told me not to touch it, and they said an alarm would go off. So like I knew there was going to be a punishment, but I did it anyway. I got caught. And Farm and Fleet is a hardware store. I didn't know that 911 would call you back. I I seen the operator said the same thing that I heard on that show like 100 times. Everybody remembers the 911 show, and then I just hung up. And I always owned up to my actions. I I couldn't usually explain. Just I don't know. I don't know. So the problem here is that the punishments didn't have any effect on me. So the threats of the punishment to keep me from doing stuff didn't work. I wasn't bothered by that stuff. I felt like the experiences were more important, so there was no deterrent. I didn't care about rewards that much either. Like I said, I lived in my head a lot, so not much was appealing other than I was very curious about how things worked and I wanted to experience them. And I was in grade school and I had my first experience what I would call black hat EQ. I have white hat programmers and black hat programmers. And black hat EQ is using your emotional intelligence to manipulate other people. I had a reward offered to me for straight A's by the family I was staying with. And the school, they had an assistant teacher in that room that I had a crush on. But I didn't want to do any more work because I was lazy. But I knew that for some reason these people were interested in me. So I took some things I was already good at, and I let that assistant teacher help me. She helped me with handwriting and fractions, and then I got to show improvement because it was not actually hard for me anyway. But I'd worked out in my head that if I let them help me and I showed effort, that they'd give me grades They give me better grades overall. And that worked. I got the straight A's. I don't remember what the reward was. I don't remember, but I do remember that assistant teacher. And I was always an underachiever. My high school guidance counselor, he got frustrated with me for carrying a B plus average. He always wanted to push me to things he thought I'd be good at, but he wanted to deter me from things that like I was interested in, like programming. I programmed for a decade. I'm still in the tech industry. I didn't at the time I didn't have any interest in competing for these prizes or statuses that everyone seemed to be chasing. I didn't really care about the career field I was going into. I just didn't have a lot of future plans at the time. But if you're not going up, then you're not growing, right? So what happens though when these things aren't motivating the people? What happens to the individual contributor at a technical company when they don't want to move up? They just want to be a contributor. And I at a previous company, they were just rolling out a software called Lattice. And Lattice is software that helps with team setups, performance reviews, and goal setting. So they were graduating from something that worked fine into something that had processes so that you could do way better. And with that, there came feedback of the career paths. And I watched that start to get rolled out. And these are some of the things that changed about that culture that I really just couldn't get on board with, because it was a flat structure and I liked that. I liked everyone just being a developer. The review process that we had, it was already working. This was just seemed like an adding process. And the career goals, like I said, they didn't make sense because there was only senior developers. It was a flat structure. So we weren't growing by staff. So I couldn't make sense of it. So our default stance is usually to treat the symptoms. So we can't lose our people, right? We need to make sure they're heard. But what we should really do is realize that system that we're operating in is broken, and we got to fix the cause. Because let's say you make senior level 1, senior level 2, and senior level 3, because everyone's senior already. So eventually you're going to have a handful of senior level 3s who now you can't motivate anymore because there's nowhere to go. And what if we want them to stop doing things? What if we want someone to stop, but they're not concerned with punishments like I was? They might try to avoid them, but ultimately in the tech industry, there's real no punishment because the career field's understaffed. That means you can't even threaten to fire them like effectively. And how do we inspire people when we want something to get done? Because we don't usually know. The system is that we're familiar with using is broken. So as leaders, we have to figure this out. So let's look at Lattice and the OKRs as an example here. The OKRs is objective and key results. It's a specific way to set goals. So another company, same thing, Lattice, same system. There was a rollout the tool was great because it handled that particular way to set goals, those OKRs. And so they described what Lattice was and what it was for, and then there was some beta testing, and then got rolled out. So fast forward a little bit, and then there's messages that to name the calendar invites specific things for the goal setting workshops. Name the calendar invite something very specific, because it turns out that the syncs it wasn't a great job. People weren't doing good at the syncs. They didn't really know what those were for. And the OKRs had been changed a few times because you can align with the company, you have personal goals, and it's really unclear because people didn't know, like, the key results they're supposed to be metrics but not binary, and it just wasn't very well understood. And OKRs, again, it's just one type of goal setting workshop. And the 360 review process, performance reviews, that it doesn't have to be 360. is they all have the same fundamental goals. That's what they're going for. It's career growth and performance reviews. And when we work as leaders with people in one-on-ones, we tend to do coaching and general career guidance and growth. I hope that's what you're doing. And everyone really understands that. So what this process and the other goal setting process is for is trying to aid with the couple times a year. It's important for someone to reflect and realign those goals, the long-term goals, and in accordance with the growth. And that's what the purpose of the sync is, to realign those long-term goals and to course correct. And the performance review, 360 review, is so you get feedback from more than one person's point of view. You get it from your peers, your manager. Everyone gets to give the input and you're not boxed in. And that needs to happen at normal cadences. And that's the same with the performance reviews. When you see them, various styles of reviews, they're usually empty or just good jobs because we assign them to people. It's part of the process. So I told one of my reports before not to worry about Lattice. They had too many tools. They didn't want to do it. So I just wrote the goals down. I discussed them with them pretty often, and I made sure there was progress. And then every now and then we thought about new goals. But I didn't put that stuff in the Lattice system. Because my whole intention there was the goal setting and the career development. I did miss a minimum bar. I mean, there's logistical stuff for the business needs. But, I mean, I think we know by now how good I am at staying in the lines. So I want to tell you how I learned to motivate people because it's pretty simple. There's 3 steps. Step 1 is tell them what the goal is. Step 2 is communicate why. And step 3 is get out of the way. It doesn't make sense to hire smart people and then tell them what to do. We hire smart people so they can tell us what to do. That's quoting Steve Jobs. Everybody just quotes Steve Jobs. So let's break the steps down a little bit here because these steps can be done with varying degrees of implementation. So step 1 is tell them about the goal. So what we tend to do here is we give them the processes or the steps to make sure that goal is achieved. And then we can incentivize the people who don't naturally do it. And then sometimes we can punish the people who fall short. And we generally end up micromanaging here. Because the opposite side of this is we just deliver the process and we don't even tell them the goal at all. So step 2 is communicate the why. And that's where the biggest breakdown usually is. As we're given these tasks and these projects, and we don't have a good explanation of all the thoughts that went behind it. Or we get things delivered to us by managers as some kind of handoff or something, but the why here is important. It's not just that you have to explain that why to somebody. You have to believe that why. Then you have to pass that on. And a lot of times we're guilty of not passing that on because we have the processes instead of the goals. And the why here doesn't seem important. And you're not done when you've done your best to deliver that why. Because you got to make sure that person's on board with it. And the best way to do that is to get them to vocalize it from their perspective. And hopefully with no prompt, just in general conversation, because that's going to show you that they've internalized that and incorporated it somehow. And that why, it doesn't have to be the same as your why. But they have to understand your why, and then they have to align with it somehow with a why of their own. And what happens as long as you pass that baton on, then you don't have to do much else. I mean, a purpose is gonna motivate and drive anybody who's aligned with it. And then step 3 is get out of the way. And that's the hardest part for people. And That ties in with the goals and the micromanaging, because you've delivered the purpose. You only have to be there for support, because too much involvement can derail just as much as not knowing that end goal or that why. And that's basically it. You tell them what the goal is, you make sure they internalize the why, and then you let them achieve the goal with just as little process as possible. And then they're going to be creative. They're going to use their own styles. They'll take risks, appropriate risks, and they'll just do good things. And you can guide them through it if you want, but you got to remember it's your team, and you got to trust your team. But if you can't trust your team, well, then you got to train them until you can. And you can use the same steps, but your first goal is to train. Because as a leader, your job is to build that team that you can trust, and you can motivate and engage them. That you can delegate tasks, and that way they can shine. So your goal's got to be to create a team capable of doing the job without you. And that includes training somebody who would replace you. But training is your top priority if you find yourself in that position. And that training in itself can motivate a lot of people. Okay, so now what happens if they fail? Well, there are a lot of different degrees at how much control of a process you give. If you're delegating and not just abdicating, then you'll stay in that information loop and you'll be able to monitor it so that doesn't happen. But it's still likely to happen. I mean, people fail. And that's okay, because it'll give you training materials, and it'll be where you can help that person grow. And if they mess up, don't fault them. You probably encourage them for the effort. Make it a learning experience, and then move on. And then tell them when they do good, because compliments and recognition, that's better than prizes and rewards. But it has the best impact when it's done personally and privately. Now, positive feedback is just as important as negative feedback. And you can give public recognition. Just the impact, it still needs to be personal. So these things, that's why I don't like having full processes laid out. As soon as you start making bullet lists, I feel constrictive. I don't want to be micromanaged. I need the freedom to operate in my style, and I don't necessarily think my style of achievement is what works for everybody else, because my personality and my home life, they're not the same as everybody else's. But my creativity, I don't like it filtered through restrictive processes, because more often than not, I end up breaking the rules anyway. But that's my personality, though, and that may or may not resonate with you. And in both cases, I think that just goes to the point that people are just very different. So some ways this can be specific to you. Coaching, mentoring, leading. That's the obvious one, helping people reach their goals. And that's usually pretty easy because people tend to be self-motivated with their own goals. But we can check that motivation. We could just make sure it's there, because sometimes people set goals because they're supposed to. So we just need to give them something to align with. And the big one here is when you might be helping them grow to a goal as a response to feedback. And that leads into conflict resolution. That type of feedback, we don't normally think of that as a time where motivation's the solution. But let's look at conflicts this way. Imagine in all conflicts, you're the peer. That's with your manager, with your peers, with your own reports, with your kids. Because you don't have authority now. You can't tell someone what to do, because you can't control other people. And if you still want the conflict solved, you have to motivate them. And then we can motivate ourselves. We know what it takes now, so we can check in. We may have to find that alignment of our own. We may have to ask more questions, but if we're lacking, then we know how to get it. And in the same token, when there's messages given from the company, broad messages aren't usually specific, so they have varying levels of impact. So we can make sure we're motivated. We can align ourselves with that. Then we can help to pass that on in a specific way with our peers and our circle and our reports. So we can make sure that the messages get passed through where they normally wouldn't. And I mean, like most topics, motivation is a big topic. So here, this is my goal, and hopefully there's enough process here to get started. And I've done my best to explain what I think is wrong and why this is important. And now I think it's time to get out of the way.